But most of the people that we deal with are in fact in violation of the program. So from our perspective, a vast majority of people that we are associated with are in violation.
What kind
Does that
of
make
violation?
sense? So I mean, it's a different perspective. If I contact 200 people and I take enforcement action against 190 of them, then the majority of the people that I'm exposed to are in violation of the act. That's not to paint every, that's, sir, I'm still talking.
Russell, let him finish, and then we'll let the next person ask their question,
I'm not
please.
advocating that we paint everybody with that brush, but I think that is part of the issue when we sit down at a table, and I've been in meetings where advocates and proponents are, you know, it's pretty heated conversation, and it's a misunderstanding of the perspective, okay? Just because I come in contact with a certain amount of people and I take enforcement action against a percentage of them, that's my perspective, okay? That's not to paint everybody with the same brush, that all medical marijuana patients or people associated with the program are abusing it. Does that make sense?
Russell,
Can I clarify your?
Yes. Next person, please. Name and hometown.
My name's Andrea Adams, and I live in Talent, Oregon. I have a question for Leland, Berger, and then I guess everybody's opinion. As far as the dispensaries being set up as nonprofits, I've read the legislation or Measure 74, and it seems a bit of a gray area. I'm wondering if you can speak to specifically if you will need to have, because it says you don't have to receive your 501c3 status through the federal government, but then I also found out that generally for the state to grant nonprofit, they go by the federal government's 501c3 status. So it's like, yes, me too, kind of an issue. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. And also because the state is, if Measure 74 passes, quarterly, the dispensaries would have to pay 10% of their gross to the state. So I was wondering if you could speak to the economic benefits to the state of Oregon from those funds. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
I'd be glad to. The Oregon revised statutes have a section on corporations, and I am primarily a criminal defense lawyer, not a business lawyer. But I've associated with a lawyer who's familiar with business law, and the way he explained it to me is that there is a section of the Corporations Code that defines what you need to be a nonprofit, and it does not require, and it's not linked to the federal 501c3 status.
Leslie,
so that information is incorrect.
Your dispensary is a nonprofit, correct?
That's correct. In California, and this is how I was advised by the lawyers at Oaksterdam to set it up, is that you register through the Secretary of State's office as a mutual benefit nonprofit corporation as opposed to a public benefit nonprofit, which is the 501c3 through the federal government. So you function as a nonprofit, but you also pay taxes. If you register as a 501c3, you don't have to pay taxes, and they've advised you pay your taxes.
I would, and the advice I would give would be to find a lawyer who's familiar with business law, and who has set up, and because there are all these formalities, all these things that have to happen, corporate formalities. I know that much about it, and I know that you need good counsel on that. On the, you asked about the gross. Oh yeah, so. Well, I can tell you that in the voters pamphlet, I got mine in the mail. Did anybody else get theirs? If you look under each of the proposed ballot initiatives, they did an economic forecast, and the economic forecast is between $3 and $20 million, which is, you know, quite a range, I think. I mean, if somebody, you know, came to me and said, well, I want you to be my lawyer, and I'm willing to pay you between $3,000 and $20,000, you know, I don't think I would take that case. But and it's hard to guess really what the number is going to be, but that's the number that is the official number that's in the voters pamphlet.
Okay. Next question from the audience. Name and hometown, please.
Okay. My name is George Soneski, and I'm from Ashland. And I understand the beginning of this was to talk about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to state this off because I don't want to get painted one way or another. I'm kind of a middle-of-the-road person, but I've been clean and sober since 1985, okay? So yeah, I used drugs in the past. I've drank a lot. I got away from it. I'm glad I'm off it. I understand these people's pain, though, okay, because I take 2 ibuprofens at night just so my back will relax and go to sleep. But to clarify, I can understand law enforcement was because I know someone personally who lived way on the boondocks. Their neighbor rented property to somebody else who decided they wanted to grow marijuana, and the story was that they were growing it for somebody else. My friend is the wife of the house said, well, I don't appreciate the smell coming over, blah, blah, blah. She called up and she said, can you just tell me if this operation is legal? And the police could not tell her whether it was legal or not. It turned out that they were actually growing more plants than what was legal. When the person came back from, they were living up in Alaska, decided to move back, they found out that the people have trashed out their house. They just used the house just as a place for business and raised their pit bulls. And all the plants were harvested. There were strange cars going by every so often. So I can understand when you guys look at the law, you're dealing with those type of people who go out and say, oh, we're doing it for people. You know, I'm growing these for my aunts or my uncles, whoever, and yet they're abusing the system. And I like to see this law come forth, but I also like to see more legislators coming forth to try to regulate to get the people who are trying to go outside of that. My second point, though, is I'm an asthmatic. And I look at it as if, let's say the law go pass, and here on campus, you're supposed to smoke 15 feet from the door. I have to constantly remind either workers or students that they have to move away from here. But if I get secondhand smoke, and let's say I'm planning to go maybe for a government job, get secondhand smoke, and then I get tested, and then I come up positive. And so I like to see the law come forth, but I like to see a little bit more hand on it on how do we regulate so people who don't want to be around it don't have to be around it.
For marijuana, much like with cigarette smoke, in other
That's
words.
exactly.
Okay.
Because let's face it, marijuana smoking, secondhand smoke is just as bad as cigarette smoking.
The Measure 74 adds on to the current Medical Marijuana Act, and the current Medical Marijuana Act says if you use in a public place or in public view or in a correctional facility or a juvenile correctional facility, you lose the exception and you don't have the affirmative defense. So it's not legal for a patient to use in a public place. The 15 foot of the door smoking thing is a whole different situation. I wanted to tell you two other things, though. One is, although it's counterintuitive, I have a friend who increased his lung capacity for using cannabis for asthma. And the second thing I want to tell you, and I speak now as a father of a son who's coming up on 22 months clean and sober, is that there are AA groups meeting, and correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, in the Bay Area of medical marijuana patients. So the two aren't necessarily inconsistent. I think that there's this misnomer that people think that because people are using cannabis that they're getting high, that they're stoners getting over. When we're talking about the therapeutic use of medical cannabis, frankly, a lot of patients don't get the psychoactive effect. There's new research coming out that the higher CBD dosages may actually be more therapeutic and that have the lower THC, so that there's less psychoactive effect. And I just wanted to share that with you so that in the hopes you could keep an open mind about all of this.
Okay, but I also, what you did not talk to is about, we got to make sure, like, we got federal government and state government laws that saying if you test positive, you can't get those jobs. And that's, I think that's also, people should know that. If they're going to take that, you're going to have to understand that you may not be able to get those.
That's a really good point, and it's worse than that. I mean, the Oregon Supreme Court has said that an Oregon employer can refuse to hire or fire if you pee dirty, whether you're a patient or not.
Right.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to monopolize the
That's all right.
conversation.
George, thank you for the questions. Eric, I want to come back to you because you were starting to say something before about the abuses within the existing medical marijuana system. What often are the things that you end up getting people for when they're wandering outside the existing medical marijuana system?
Can I come back to that?
Sure.
I wanted to comment on the gentleman. It's important to note that, you know, all of these participants in the program, the only one authorized to use marijuana under the OMMP is the patient, not the caregiver, not the grower, not dispensary or the producer. And so I think there's a lot of people under the impression that, you know, this is a free ticket to use. And segueing into your question, one of the things that we see a lot are, you know, patients, you know, there's a reduction in the amount of marijuana that they have available to them because they're growers and or their caregiver takes advantage of that relationship. And, you know, either puts it to their own use or sells it to the black market, diverts it from the patient. And, you know, we actually get quite a few calls from actual participants in the program as patients that can't get their marijuana. They have no idea where their grow site is. They can't get their caregiver to call them back. You know, so I mean, I think that's one of the things, and when we talk about abuse of the program, is people will sign up to be a grower, or a person responsible for a grow site, and, you know, they get to smoke weed. I mean, I think that's the perception sometimes. It's not, again, I don't mean to paint anybody with a broad brush, but in our experience, we get that quite often. You know, there's also a situation where we often find an abuse of the patient-caregiver-grower relationship. The statute says you get to have 24 ounces between the three of you. The grower can have 24, the caregiver can have 24, or the patient can have 24. It's not everybody gets 24. And sometimes we'll stop a car and, you know, there's a patient in the car and a caregiver in the car, but when you start digging, they're caregiver for each other. And, you know, what they're doing is just using the system to increase the amount of marijuana they can be in possession with at one time. And that's very hard because, again, we don't receive information from OMMP. We can only corroborate or confirm information that we already have. So if somebody refuses to tell me, I mean, they can say, yeah, I'm a patient and a caregiver, and my passenger says, yes, I'm a patient and a caregiver. They don't have to identify that relationship is between the two of us. I don't have the information to say, oh, well, you're only supposed to have X amount of marijuana in possession. Because when I check OMMP, I get a yes or a no. They're yes, either a patient, or yes, they're yes, they're a caregiver. Or no, they're not.
I wanted to explain a little bit about that, if I could, just
Briefly,
briefly. You know, the reason why, when we drafted the Medical Marijuana Act, we put it in the Department of Human Services, is that they're used to dealing with confidential information. If you go to the health department and because it hurts when you pee, and they say you have a sexually transmitted disease, that's where they report it. If you are adopted, that's where the adoption records are. If you are a participant in the Death with Dignity program, that's where the records are. So we understood that the Department of Human Services understood about medical privacy. And the law is that the information on the Medical Marijuana Act is private within the agency, except that it can be disclosed to law enforcement to verify. That's what the law is, and they can't repeat it. In some parts of the states, and I don't know that Tim's done that here, but the law enforcement reports arrests and locations and gardens and the rest of it. And that, my view is that that's contrary to that law. But the program itself is helpful in this. The other thing that Tim was talking about is this more recent thing where there's a thing called LEDS, which is the Law Enforcement Data System. And correct me if I'm wrong, but every police officer that has a computer on board has access to LEDs.
Most officers have LEDs.
To it, and if you type in Tim, you know, and it comes, you know, yes, no, pending is what it'll come back. If it's during business hours and you can get in touch with the program, they'll tell you the number of patients that are designated to a particular grow site, the number of growers that are designated to a particular grow site, and they will share the information with you about who's a grower for what patient. The last point I want to make ties in with what Dr. Gould was saying. The problem is one of perspective. What Erik and Tim are seeing is a very small percentage of participants in the